It all began 1,000 years ago, during the war against the Demon King. On the day when the demonic beasts stormed across the front lines to slaughter humanity, it felt like the start of another overused tale, one seen countless times before. But let's continue. Soon you'll see how this story is unique. So, the blood-soaked war dragged on, endless and brutal, with humanity clinging to survival. The battlefield never dried, every inch drenched in crimson, while the beasts slowly thinned out. Then, without warning, a figure appeared atop a black dragon. That was the moment the legendary Mage entered the stage. With terrifying ease, he wiped the battlefield clean, crushing the horde in a single strike. The dragon's presence alone was enough to paralyze the beasts with fear, while soldiers fell to their knees in worship of the hero. But victory turned to shock. Out of nowhere, the Mage collapsed, lifeless. At the exact moment, triumph was his. His death remained a mystery. Before the end, he left behind a promise. He would await the one consumed with the thirst for strength, the one who would never fall to temptation or corruption. The scene snapped to the present. Inside a subway, all eyes were locked on the screen broadcasting a UFC fight. It was the 17th title defense of the reigning world champion. The crowd around the octagon went wild, voices uniting in a roar for the challenger. In the blue corner stood Patrick, the challenger, 120 kilos of carved muscle, built like a bodybuilder, the audience urging him to kill. Opposite him, in the red corner, was the champion, 37 wins, 0 losses, a man who had never tasted defeat. His body was honed to perfection. They stared each other down. The announcer pointed out that Kim Jin-ho hadn't been using his foot much lately. Rumors spread fast. Patrick himself had claimed the champion must be injured and that today would be the day the streak ended. Whispers filled the arena. Jin-ho was 48 years old. No man could keep winning forever. The bell rang. Patrick froze. He hadn't even moved, and yet the champion's presence was crushing, suffocating. Terror radiated off the man like heat. Still, Patrick knew about the injury. He darted forward, aiming low for a takedown, ready to slam the champion to the mat. Confidence surged. This arrogant bastard had stepped into the cage injured, and now he would pay. But just as Patrick's hands brushed the leg, just as his grin spread in triumph, light tore through the air. Blood exploded across the cage, and in that instant, everything was over. Patrick was wrecked in the cage. Kim Jin-ho had held back his leg on purpose. Otherwise, the fight would have been too easy. Pure arrogance, dripping from every move. Later, in the locker room, he threw on his coat, slammed the locker shut, and got ready to leave. A buddy, half joking, tried to stop him, saying there were people waiting for interviews, fans wanting a word. Jin-ho brushed it off, telling him to let them send a message. His time was already packed, and he had better things to do. The friend insisted. Outside, rain poured and traffic was chaos. Jin-ho grinned, saying that was even better. He'd run through it and arrive quicker. The next moment, the door slammed, and by the time the friend tried to follow, talking about the 30 kilometers ahead, Jin-ho had already vanished. Now it was the reporters swarming the coach, demanding answers about how he had built such a legend. Jin-ho headed home while the coach stood there, heavy with a sadness only he could feel. His mind replayed the first time he had seen the kid fight. The debut ended with a knockout punch. The second, a brutal elbow. Most fights never even lasted 30 seconds. That kind of talent only left a hollow feeling behind. The coach was certain. No one alive would ever stand against Kim Jin-ho until the day he decided to retire. To the press, he revealed the truth. The so-called injured leg was nothing more than a way to make the fight harder. Sometime later, Jin-ho arrived at his apartment, drenched from the storm. The doorway stacked high with gifts from fans. The man wasn't just a champion, he was the world champion, and his home proved it. Inside that apartment building, he had carved out a mansion, a massive domain that screamed victory. Yet what he loved most wasn't the trophies or luxury. It was the glowing rig in the corner, the gaming PC. Jin-ho wasn't just a fighter, he was hooked on games, obsessed with one in particular, Last Savior. A title so brutally difficult that even Korean players, who lived for punishing challenges, had abandoned it. Not him. For 10 years, every single day, he had been grinding, fighting against stronger enemies and terrifying monsters. That was his second life. That was his training. Sitting at the screen, he smiled, hoping for once he wouldn't win like always. On the battlefield, his character stood ready. What thrilled him the most was the rush of facing down a monster. Once again, he was locked in battle with the Demon King, Azar. Time passed, and Jinho's face shifted. He stood toe-to-toe with the towering creature, its health bar almost drained. His eyes locked on the HP gauge, disbelief hitting him hard. At this pace, victory was his. He struck again, demanding resistance from the weakened foe. He slashed at the legs, questioning how something so obvious wasn't being avoided. The NPC flailed, struggling to fight back, but it was useless. Jinho's blonde avatar carved through it with ease, irritation growing at how predictable the patterns had become. Every single attack connected, flawless and unchallenged. A lion's aura flared, unleashing a storm of blades across the Demon King's body. When he booted up the game today, the goal had been simple: fight hard, chase victory. But now, staring at the inevitable, fear twisted inside him. He didn't want to win. He willed the Demon King to endure, to strike differently, to push back. He bent his own commands, even sabotaging inputs to avoid sealing the fight. It didn't matter. One final slash cut Azar down. System messages flared across the screen, hailing him as the first player to ever kill the Demon King. Jinho froze. His expression hardened. He was now champion in two different worlds. The mouse drifted on the desk, his anger boiling. Who was left to face him now? What opponent could exist? His mind wandered absurdly. Maybe he should charge into the storm, find a bear in the forest and wrestle it. But then, in the clouds above, a golden light cracked open, followed by a jagged bolt of lightning. He sensed something racing toward him, eyes darting upward just as the strike slammed into his apartment. The screen went black. Vertigo washed over him, his whole body buzzing with numbness. He blinked, and suddenly the rain was real, falling around him. Confusion spread. When had he even stepped outside? His gaze dropped. Strange orange pants clung to his legs. A hand gripped his shoulder. A voice barked his number, 218. A blonde girl with piercing blue eyes stood beside him, urgency blazing in her stare. The number 172 was printed across her chest. She rushed him forward, warning that wasting time meant death. Still dazed, Jinho turned and realized where he was. Ahead, dozens of inmates were running for their lives inside a prison shaped like a fortress. His eyes locked on one of the flags, an eagle stitched into the fabric. The pattern felt familiar. Before he could process it, 172 yanked him back to reality, reminding him this was their last shot at escaping. If they missed this chance, they'd rot forever inside the butcher's prison. The weight of that name hit hard. The infamous prison, feared by all, now stood before him. Even with the pieces coming together in his head, Jinho was still groggy, dragged along by 172. Around them, prisoners pulled at the gates in a desperate tug of war. His instincts screamed it had to be a dream, yet the sharpness of it all made it impossible to deny. He ran with her, thoughts swirling, trying to grasp how he ended up inside the very game he used to play. In the end, he forced himself to calm down, first escape, then figure out the mystery. Suddenly, he froze. Something didn't sit right. He pulled 172's attention toward the chaos. This was supposed to be the most secure prison of all, yet the place was falling apart too easily. She explained Clark, the director, wasn't there. He had stepped out, and that was the reason for the uprising. But Jinho didn't buy it. He grabbed her by the collar and dragged her the opposite way. She fought back, furious, but his instincts roared. This prison was far too secure to collapse like this. Whoever went through that gate wasn't coming back alive. While 172 struggled against him, the others finally ripped the door open. Celebrations erupted, shouts of freedom filling the air. Dozens poured through, laughing, convinced they were saved. Their joy ended instantly. Blood sprayed, limbs tore apart. Out of nowhere, Clark stood before them. Cold eyes, brutal presence. His voice echoed as he condemned them as worthless insects. With a single command, his troops swarmed in. 172's face twisted with shock, questioning his sudden appearance. Jinho didn't hesitate. This was a setup from the start. Panic exploded. The same criminals who had cheered moments ago were now sprinting back inside, screaming for their lives. The prison walls were drenched in blood, painted red by their desperation. Later, Clark ordered the survivors rounded up. A line of broken prisoners formed. Among them, only Jinho and 172 stood out. Not like the rest. While the others seemed like copies stamped from the same mold, these two were different. She stood right beside him, gagging hard, until it all burst out into her hand. Disgusting. It would have been better if she had just puked on the floor. And to make things worse, the moment she moved to vomit, she was punched for it. Jinho froze, stunned by how brutal they were, even toward kids. No wonder riots exploded in this place nonstop. If that happened again, he knew he'd have no choice but to throw himself into a fight. That's when Clark appeared, towering like a monster. He mocked him, calling the kid either too lucky or too cowardly for not trying to escape. Typical, he said. Mages were all cowards, pathetic excuses for rivals. The thought of comparing himself to them was sickening. His face leaned in close to Jinho's, venom dripping from every word, promising that Arohan would regret surviving this day. Then he walked away, leaving the protagonist staring at his own reflection, questioning if he had just been called that name. Arohan. A week later, the sky stretched wide and blue, while Jinho worked under it. The entire day had been wasted stacking rocks. Not for any real reason, just pointless labor to keep them from sitting still. His hands were shredded and torn apart. The man, Kim Jinho, 218, Arohan, whatever he was supposed to be, kept lifting stones, cursing how even that drained his stamina. This body was pathetic, weak to the core. They had labeled him a mage, but when he tried magic, nothing happened. It was a complete failure. It didn't add up. Arohan was supposed to be a name tied to one of the most powerful mage families in the region, and then it clicked. He probably belonged to that family, but had been thrown away for having no magical talent. Knowing their cruelty and sadism, it made perfect sense. A guard barked at him, ordering the rock to be carried to the other side. He obeyed without a word, moving it across the yard. His eyes weren't on the rock. He was waiting for something else. The system window. The screen still flashed. Synchronization delayed due to excessive data. A cruel irony. In his original world, he had been too strong, unstoppable. Now here, this body was stuck, lagging, struggling just to download what it needed. Days passed. Mealtime came, though meal was too generous a word. A bowl of water with a chunk of bread hard enough to crack teeth. He chewed and spat curses under his breath. No matter how hard he trained, with food like this, he wouldn't build muscle, wouldn't build anything. Then 172 appeared, questioning why he wasn't eating the bread again. She reached for it, but he didn't allow it. Something about her felt off. Jinho kept thinking this companion was peculiar. Was it a boy? A girl? He couldn't even tell anymore. Something about this person didn't add up. What struck him most was the question of why someone this young was locked up here at all. 172 warned him to stay alert. Lately, thanks to him, everyone's workload had increased, and the other prisoners weren't pleased. That explained why so many eyes were fixed on him every time he walked by. 172 pressed further, telling him to be especially cautious around 589, the prisoner leader, infamous for his brutality inside the arena. Jinho told her it was safer not to interact, since even being close to him might drag her into danger. But 172 shrugged it off, claiming she already knew everyone and didn't need to worry. The protagonist rose to his feet, saying the truth would come out right now. And sure enough, a group of prisoners started closing in. He muttered that this was exactly the kind of situation she had warned about. At that instant, 172's eyes widened when she noticed the number. That man was 589, the so-called leader of the prisoners, or more accurately, the Bald Gang's top dog. So far, only Jinho and 172 still had hair. That couldn't just be coincidence. The bald leader stepped forward, saying he'd heard the increased workload was all because of the newcomer. Jinho wanted to know what that had to do with him. The response came sharp. It was his fault. Before he could even argue, a massive hand came down, wide as his head, smashing into the ground and leaving a crater. 172 cried out for him, but in the same moment, someone caught the leader by the neck. Jinho wasn't here to play. He drove a knee straight into the man's chin. The bald crew froze, panicked, shouting for their boss. But Jinho's expression shifted. This wasn't like before. His strike had done nothing. 589 glared at him, unimpressed, asking what kind of weak hit that was. Then he snatched Jinho by the collar, ready to spin him through the air like a toy. The hit sent him flying into the wall like some protagonist caught in the middle of a messy breakup. His friend panicked nearby, shouting for 218. The boss stood tall, declaring that if the kid survived that throw, it only meant his death sentence had already been written. But the timing couldn't be better. Synchronization finally hit 100%. The villain's grin widened, clueless about what was about to happen. It was like someone had finally plugged fiber optics into this cursed system that always lagged. The real fight was about to start. Jinho rose, body blazing with energy, fists glowing with blue light, aura spilling into the air. The bald thugs stiffened, watching as he flexed his hands, shifted his stance, and warmed up his footing. He was already squared like an MMA fighter, inviting the boss into the ring. The boss sneered, mocking him for being abandoned by his own clan and still acting high and mighty. Jinho didn't care for words anymore. He demanded action. The boss lost patience and charged straight at him. Jinho spotted an opening, snapping out a low kick toward the leg. But it wasn't that easy. The boss caught his foot mid-swing, grinning, ready to teach him a brutal lesson. Wrong move. Jinho twisted, spinning with force, and smashed the side of the man's head with a clean strike. The boss staggered, dazed, only for another blow to slam into his chin before he could recover. He reeled, body ready to collapse, but Jinho didn't stop. A solid kick followed, sending him stumbling until he finally crashed to the ground, unconscious. Standing over him, Jinho exhaled dramatically, muttering that this was exactly why he avoided using his legs. The moment hung for a second, until chaos erupted. Every prisoner around pulled out their makeshift blades, cheap shanks so flimsy they barely counted as knives. They all closed in on him. Jinho planted his foot on the boss, yanked his arm back, and made his warning clear. If anyone dared to move closer, this man would never be able to feed himself again. The bald crew froze, paralyzed, unsure what to do. Jinho ground his heel harder into the arm, glaring at the crowd, calling out that too many of them were still standing around. If they wanted to stop this, call the guards. One of them panicked, sprinting away, yelling that once the guards freed the boss, Jinho was as good as dead. But in the end, fear won. The gang caved, hauling their fallen leader away instead of striking back. Later, inside the cell, 172 looked at him in awe, demanding to know how he pulled that off. It was unbelievable. On top of that, she swore he even looked taller all of a sudden. Something had changed. Jinho brushed it off, saying it was the result of hauling rocks day after day. But the truth was different. What really happened was his body syncing with his real-life stats from the game. For the first time, the protagonist had dragged his real body into this world, because it was way more overpowered than the one inside the game. Normally, it was always the opposite. Some weakling thrown into a body that turned out amazing. But here, it was reversed. What stunned him most were the stats. Zed Arahan, loaded with S-rank immunities. Immortal Duelist, Challenger rank, S-rank Archmage. Grim carried everything stacked, but something was off. His class really was Mage. That alone cut his agility, strength, and defense by half. And worse, even as a mage, he had 0 mana, which meant he was losing half his attributes for absolutely nothing. It made no sense. The Arahan family was supposed to be full of prodigies, geniuses blessed with magic. Yet here he was, stuck in a trash body that contradicted everything. Meanwhile, 172 just stared at him, baffled, watching him mutter and laugh like a lunatic on his bed, trying to make sense of why he had reincarnated into such garbage. He forced himself to calm down, running through his options. The so-called growth penalty was cutting everything in half, but still, half was better than 0. And physical strength? That was something he knew how to build himself, even faster. The real obstacle was the food. That slop they called meals wasn't helping his body develop at all. What really drew his attention was the pile of S-rank talents sitting on his sheet. If he had all that and just a bit of mana, he'd be completely broken. Blessings like those were for only a handful of people in the world. No matter. He'd figure it out. He just needed a way around the no mana curse. There had to be a solution. Right then, the silence was broken by a guard shouting numbers from outside the cell. The ones called were forced to line up and leave. He asked what was happening, and 172 explained. Those people were part of the death coup. One last meal, then execution. He nodded, then asked his companion's name. To his surprise, the answer was Ryu, a friend after all. The protagonist introduced himself as Zed Arahan. Zed asked if Ryu planned on staying in prison long. Ryu answered casually that he'd be escaping soon. Zed wanted to know how. The answer was simple. The guard in front carried the key. Zed figured Ryu was planning to steal the key, but Ryu shut that idea down fast. The man guarding it might be retired, but he was still a 5-circle knight. And Clark wasn't just any knight. He was the embodiment of everything that despised mages. In the world of Last Savior, knights and mages had always hated each other, and Clark carried that hatred like a badge. Now Zed had a bigger problem. How the hell was he supposed to escape a prison locked down by a 5-circle warrior? But Ryu brushed it off, saying the trick wasn't strength, it was subtlety. Just steal it without Clark ever noticing. For someone raised on the streets, that wasn't impossible. The issue was Clark himself. The man was too sharp, too alert, and so far no opening had ever appeared. Zed grinned. For the first time, he could actually see a path forward. The next morning, work began again. A guard announced new orders. By command of the boss, the prisoners would be hauling even more rocks than usual. Complaints broke out immediately. The inmates shouted it was impossible, that they'd all die if it kept up. The guard silenced one with a blade pressed to his throat. Another bald prisoner stepped up, demanding to know why they were being worked to death. There was no reason for it. The guard's smirk said everything. He told them they already knew whose fault it was. All eyes turned toward Zed. Then, with a fake cough, the guard walked away, promising to return soon. 172 warned him. It was obvious. They were setting him up, feeding him to the mob. Zed had already noticed something off about these so-called knights. They weren't following any real code of honor. Their behavior was closer to thugs in uniform. Ryu slipped out quietly, refusing to get involved. But judging by his look, he had some kind of plan. He swore he wouldn't let Zed die here. Meanwhile, the prisoners came to the same conclusion. The work would only get easier if Zed was gone. The protagonist smirked. So be it. An unavoidable fight. The first thug charged, only to be met with a crushing knee to the chin. His body dropped hard, a heavy thud against the ground. The others froze, suddenly unsure. Who was next? Who had the guts to rush him now? Zed taunted them, daring the whole crowd to come at him together. The second wave surged forward, and the first to reach him caught a hammering blow straight to the skull. He collapsed instantly. Zed didn't stop. Elbows flew, fists smashed, bones cracked. And through it all, his rage boiled. These idiots kept coming one by one, lining up for slaughter instead of storming him all at once. Another one dropped to the ground, and Zed muttered that these guys had no bite. The moment he caught a glimpse of movement, he ducked low, barely slipping past a strike. He answered with another knee, headbutts, fists flying, chaos everywhere, a full-on brawl. From a distance, Ryu watched in shock. Bodies piled up in Zed's wake, and he realized he had never known his friend was this strong. Right then, someone beside Ryu whispered for him to follow. Meanwhile, Zed drove his boot into another stomach, sending the guy crashing down. As expected, the thugs pulled out those tiny knives again, barely 3 centimeters, but dangerous enough. Zed smashed one straight in the face, daring the next wave to hit harder. And now he was enjoying it. This was his element. His whole life had been built around fighting, and nothing thrilled him more than standing at the edge of death. The rush of slipping past a strike that could have ended him. That was his addiction. It was why he lived for the game, why martial arts consumed him. Another chin cracked under his fist. Another neck rattled beneath his blows. He looked unhinged, completely wild. Then, suddenly, a heavy foot landed on his back, someone roaring his name. Zed Arahan. A pale, twitchy kid grabbed Ryu and threatened his life. Ryu struggled, biting, thrashing, but held tight. The lunatic promised that Ryu's death by a 2-circle knife wouldn't even be shameful. He lunged forward, but Zed slipped away, vanishing before the strike could touch him. The attacker froze, confused, swearing he had disappeared. His head whipped to the side, and there Zed stood, already talking casually with Ryu like nothing happened. The pale freak demanded to know what magic that was. Zed's smirk answered, "No magic, just pure movement." His body shifted smooth as a dancer, then snapped with brutal precision, slamming a perfect strike into the neck. The pale kid skidded across the ground, dragged like trash. That was when Clark arrived, calling for number 218, demanding an explanation. Before Zed could speak, Ryu stepped in, insisting 218 was the victim. He explained he'd been taken hostage, and Zed had saved him. Clark's eyes swept over the floor littered with unconscious inmates. His jaw tightened, fury simmering, annoyed that his men kept ending up as nothing more than punching bags. Clark's eyes narrowed and he demanded to ask Zed something, whether he had been using mana. Zed, barely interested, shrugged it off with a half-hearted maybe. In response, Clark unleashed his aura. The pressure hit instantly. Prisoners collapsed, gasping for air, choking on the weight that crushed down on them. Even Ryu, who had been struggling to stay upright, dropped hard to the ground. Now it all made sense. Through it all, Zed stood steady, untouched. A translucent mana barrier surrounded him. One of his S-rank traits had triggered resistance to suppression. He understood now. It wasn't just resistance. It was mental immunity. His thoughts burned with arrogance. Of course this was the case. He had reached the peak on Earth, 27 straight wins at the highest level of the world. No average thug from this place could ever make him tremble. Clark, however, was losing it. He couldn't stand seeing the kid still on his feet. His fury boiled over. How the hell was a bastard with no mana resisting his aura? He poured even more into it, pressing harder, the force growing so suffocating it was on the edge of breaking everything around them. But S-rank suppression resistance was absolute. Zed didn't budge. He stood calm, one hand on his hip, unfazed, as if the crushing pressure didn't even exist. Clark's face twisted. None of it made sense. The guards begged him to stop, warning that at this rate the whole place would die. Finally, Clark cut the aura. His glare locked onto Zed, voice sharp. He told the boy to calm himself or he'd slit his throat at any second. With one last murderous stare, he turned away, ordering everyone back to work. But Zed wasn't done. He called out, demanding Clark stop. He had something to say. He declared he was done with the endless rock stacking, finished with being ambushed by every prisoner thrown his way, and because of that, he was planning to settle it once and for all. Ryu stared at him like he'd lost his mind, asking what the hell he was talking about. Zed grinned. He wanted to join death row. Clark froze, questioning if he even understood the weight of what he was saying. It wasn't a choice he could take back. Zed didn't flinch. He told Clark to record it in a crystal ball if he wanted. His decision wasn't changing. Clark smirked coldly. Perfect. He ordered a registration item to be brought, and right away Zed added one more thing. Since he was now on death row, he wanted to claim his last meal, a birdie steak. The portion was massive, enough to fill him completely. The guards' faces gave it away. It was absurdly expensive. They muttered it was madness. That steak, top quality, came only from the Southern Empire. In the game, it was one of the rarest consumables. A dish so rich it could restore strength even drained by age. Some warriors had eaten it mid-battle, turning the tide with the buff it gave, winning fights they should have lost. But Zed didn't look like he just wanted a taste. He told Clark it was only fair, considering the family he came from and the value of his life. And he warned. He knew exactly what the real thing was like. If they tried to trick him, the deal was void. Ryu couldn't handle it, demanding to know why this lunatic was chasing death. Zed almost laughed, saying he'd forgotten his friend was with him. Now both of them were tied to death row. The staff hesitated, but Clark's voice cut through, demanding they follow orders. An Arahant's life was worth the price. Ryu panicked, furious that he'd been dragged into this insanity. Time jumped forward. Back in his cell, Zed kept training. Just securing that stake took over a week, and he wasn't wasting a second. Ryu thought it was pointless. Why train if you were going to die anyway? That's when Zed revealed his system. Each attribute capped at 100. Any extra experience overflowed into whatever stat hadn't maxed out. And since every single attribute of his was already at the ceiling, all his gains were being funneled straight into mana. Right in the middle of another set, a guard called for them. Zed's grin spread. Finally, the steak was here. The meal arrived, an extremely rare slab, golden seared, dripping juices. The moment Ryu took a bite, tears welled in his eyes. He'd never eaten anything so good in his life. Zed reminded him not to forget who made it possible. As he ate, Zed could feel his body shifting. Negative status effects were being peeled away, bit by bit. Experience that had been blocked started to flow in. Elsewhere, in Clark's chamber, someone entered with the report. The banquet had begun. Clark smirked, ordering no one to disturb them. But his mind wasn't at ease. That day still gnawed at him. The boy hadn't resisted, and yet, Clark had felt something he couldn't explain. It was as if his magic failed to connect. Even retired, Clark was still a 5-circle knight. A young mage without mana should never have been capable of resisting that. Something had gone wrong that day, something beyond his grasp. But this time, he was certain he'd get the truth. His eyes lingered on the bracelet. The humiliation about to come would be 100 times worse. Not long after, the banquet ended. Both Zed and Ryu were stuffed. Ryu muttered that he was ready for death, but but Zed wasn't. His body buzzed with energy, brimming with strength, the same rush he felt after a day of pounding the sandbag. The door creaked open. He turned, already announcing their arrival, already mocking Clark, asking what came next now that every bite had been devoured. Clark began to speak, but Zed cut him down, telling him to wipe that sad smile. Disappointment was all he should feel. There wasn't even a crumb left. Clark's fury simmered. He spat that this brat thought too highly of himself, clinging to his bloodline. Still, he gripped Zed's shoulder, promising agony would follow. A bitter image formed, 40 years old, straining to handle a teenager. The truth spilled out. Clark's real goal was to exploit the presence of an Arrowhan. Any scrap of knowledge about that family was worth a fortune. He activated the bracelet. Zed felt it immediately. The man himself was a magical tool. Clark sneered, demanding what he thought of that sensation. Zed didn't flinch. He stood still, completely untouched. Ryu crumbled, nearly unconscious, collapsing to the side. Zed told Clark to behave better. Clark snapped, slamming both hands onto his shoulders, pouring in all his force. Nothing. Zed simply patted his hand away, unfazed. And just like that, the fight was set. Zed warned him. He should have killed properly if he meant it, instead of whining like a child. Clark twisted in rage, unable to comprehend why the artifact failed. The only explanation would be if the boy had a higher magical circle, but his age made that impossible, which left one option: Arrowhan bloodline, a natural counter. Clark seethed. He had clawed his way to the 5th circle through years of relentless training, sweat, and pain. Yet even a failed mage discarded by his family could resist the artifact. Then suddenly, the bracelet fizzled out, its glow dying, shutting down completely. Zed asked if Clark was finally done with the nonsense. Clark lowered his head, abandoning the threats, muttering that Zed could resist all he wanted. It didn't matter. The decree from the Majesty had already arrived. Execution at dawn. He should savor his final night in this world. Later, back in his quarters, Clark scribbled down notes. He hadn't managed to gather much, but he wrote anyway. Exhaustion weighed him down, his mana drained completely from pushing the artifact. The pen slipped from his hand as his head dropped, sleep dragging him under. Not long after, Ryu stirred awake. Zed, already up, asked if he was finally going to get moving. He told him to quit whining, even if he felt sick or like puking. Still, he acknowledged the kid's quick hands. He'd seen it. Clark almost falling forward like his body gave out, sitting, falling, forcing himself upright only to slump again. It looked strange, but Zed knew why. He praised Ryu's work. Quiet, sneaky, almost flawless. For anyone else, it would have been impossible. Ryu admitted it only succeeded because Zed distracted Clark. But then he asked if Zed was really fine after enduring all that pressure. Zed brushed it off, while Ryu muttered that there was definitely something off about him. Ignoring it, Zed pulled up his status. Mana still sat at 0, but everything else had dipped to -40, which in his case meant stronger. The brawl had pushed his body further, making it more comfortable to control. He couldn't even imagine how it would feel when his stats hit a full 100%. He turned to Ryu and laid it out. They were escaping tonight. If Ryu had recovered, it was time. Ryu panicked, saying it was madness. Clark would notice them the second they made a move. Zed smirked. Not a chance. Clark was asleep. The reason was obvious. The bracelet drained an absurd amount of mana, leaving nothing but exhaustion behind. Zed had seen the moment it powered down earlier, and that told him everything. Clark would be out cold. On top of that, he carried the keys. The moment to escape finally came, and both of them rose. Ryu hesitated, but Zed reminded him the hardest part was already done. One swift kick shattered the bars, sending them crashing to the floor. A few scraps of metal were never going to hold him. On the other side, guards immediately reacted, demanding to know what was happening. Zed didn't waste time. Of course, it was obvious. He was breaking out. Before they even realized what hit them, the two were already sprinting through the yard. But the guards weren't unprepared. They had already formed a line at the gate. Poor bastards. The one standing in the center might as well have written his will. Against Zed, he had no chance. Shots were fired, but Zed charged forward without slowing, Ryu trailing behind, terrified. The first guard in his path looked old enough to have 6 kids Zed's age. Zed blew past him, slipping by with ease before planting a palm into his face and bowling him straight into another. Both collapsed in a heap. The next guard didn't even get the chance to blink. Zed's strike crushed his jugular, dropping him instantly. Zed cut in from the right, tearing through the formation. The first man he'd thrown down was stomped into the dirt again, while the others, instead of fighting back, focused only on covering themselves. One desperate fool swung his sword, but Zed ducked low, spun, and drove his heel into the man's ribs. The crack echoed as the guard folded, crumpling onto his own legs. Another blade came down. Zed braced a hand against the ground, blocked it with fluid motion, and fired off another brutal kick. Bodies kept hitting the ground. One man slammed face-first into the dirt. Two more rushed from behind. Zed's grin stretched wider. He was enjoying every second of it. A single kick sent one guard flying into the other, both collapsing together. Ryu watched, speechless, unable to believe what his eyes were showing him. By the time it was over, the yard looked like a battlefield. Meanwhile, Clark woke to chaos. His face twisted with disbelief as he realized he had dozed off at the worst possible time. His men were scattered across the ground, begging for mercy, and number 218 was gone. He ordered the hunt to begin immediately, but the scene shifted. A quiet village hotel not far from the prison. Ryu kept scanning the area, nervous, checking every corner for signs of pursuit. The two of them stood out like flames in the dark, still dressed in their glaring orange uniforms. At least Ryu knew the streets and alleys of the region. Ryu started showing Zed around, explaining how things worked. The first priority was blending in with the locals. Their solution was simple: rob a beggar's stash and steal his clothes. That was the best disguise they were going to get. Next came food. Zed questioned how they'd manage that without a single coin, but Ryu, slippery little thief that he was, just smirked. He'd handle it with ease. He even told Zed to stay behind like some background character while he took care of business. 1 or 2 hours later, Zed's appearance had changed. His eyes were now a different color, thanks to a contact lens Ryu had brought back. They were in the southern region, where blue eyes were a trend, tied to the legacy of an old hero. Zed figured it came from the Sword X family, the clan the protagonist Tora once belonged to. Their sworn enemies were the Arahans, complete opposites even in appearance. Sword X carried blue eyes. Arahans bore red, which meant walking around with glowing red eyes would have been suicide. Later, the two found themselves in a forest cabin. Reality was only now settling in. Zed couldn't shake the thought. How the hell had he ended up trapped inside a game? And what kind of absurd situation left him sleeping in a stable, claiming life was at least entertaining this way? Zed, though, wanted answers. Why was this lunatic always stuck to him like glue? Why did he keep calling him a side character, like it was some kind of running joke? He didn't understand it. For now, he'd keep Ryu close. He still needed the help, but he'd stay cautious. Trust didn't come easy. Loneliness weighed on him. It made sense. He was 40 years old, a man who had spent his whole life fighting and gaming. His house back in the real world had been empty. No one there. Morning came, and with it, the realization that none of this had been a dream. Zed woke in the shabby cabin, still stuck in this new reality. Ryu laughed, impressed that a noble like Zed could actually sleep in a place like that. Zed asked if he liked it here, but Ryu only gave the obvious answer. There was no such thing as liking when you were poor. You sleep wherever you can. Zed might have hijacked someone else's life halfway through, but in his old one, he had been loaded. And like a true capitalist, he got up declaring it was time to make money. Because you can't level up, can't get stronger, if you don't even have a bed to crash on or food to eat. Ryu argued it wouldn't be easy. Clark's men were hunting them, and sooner or later, they'd be caught. Zed asked if he meant stealing, but brushed it off. No way. You'd never get rich fast enough in this dump by picking pockets. The only real option was money earned the hard way. The arena. And just like that, they were there. In the underground pit where sand kicked up with every stomp, where fighters locked foreheads and fists did the talking. Zed's smug grin said it all. If there was one place he belonged, it was here. The crowd went insane, packed in shoulder to shoulder, roaring as the fights turned savage. Ryu already doubted everything, swearing this had to be the wrong place. But Zed? He was locked in. To him, this was perfect. Inside the pit, one guy sank his teeth into an opponent's shoulder, only to get blasted across the face with a cannon punch. Spit, blood, and sand flew. Chaos everywhere. No rules, just survival. Punches to the ribs, bites, headbutts, anything went. The audience loved it. Ryu looked horrified, but Zed cheered like a man possessed. The fights were sharper than he'd expected. He thought he'd see nothing but amateurs, but these brawlers actually had skill. Then came the monster, Walmart Ujiro Hanma barreling in, fists swinging. He hammered the big guy with a clean shot, then strung together a brutal combo that left the man broken. Ryu panicked, shouting at Zed to rethink this madness, but when he turned, Zed was gone. The audience erupted in confusion. The beast of a fighter stood with blood on his hands, only for the crowd to gasp. Zed stood there gripping his opponent's arm, calm, cold, telling him to ease up. The brute froze, thrown off balance, unsure what he was facing. Ryu thought his friend had lost his mind, and the women in the stands screamed at the referee, asking if he'd been paid to just let someone die out there. Ujiro tore his arm free from Zed's grip, demanding to know if this brat was some noble with a death wish. But Zed denied it flatly. His look alone should have been enough. He was nothing but a street rat. The crowd erupted, jeering, demanding Ujiro crush the kid who had dared to interrupt the fight. Zed welcomed it, claiming he'd take full responsibility with a battle worth their attention. Ryu panicked, ranting in his ear, spitting out a storm of protests, but Zed silenced him. All his friend needed to do was bet everything he had on him. Ryu resisted, but Zed reminded him the steak they ate had been far too good. After this, they'd be feasting again. The fighters squared off. Ujiro sneered, calling the kid insane, but at least he didn't look afraid. Then something about Zed made his eyes narrow. His stance was sharp, breathing steady, gaze sharp with a killing aura. His posture was cleaner, deadlier than anyone Ujiro had ever faced in that pit. A chill ran through him. Fear? Impossible. How could he be shaken by a kid? Furious, he rushed forward, convinced none of it made sense. But his charge was cut short. Zed's fist snapped across his cheek like a cannon blast. Blood gushed from his nose instantly. Zed mocked him, breaking him down like a coach scolding a rookie. You never start a fight with a punch that comes from behind the shoulder. He punished him with a rapid combo, each strike cracking into Ujiro's jaw. Zed explained it mid-beatdown. You always keep your arm forward, defense and attack in one. Ujiro was helpless, his face battered by a storm of machine gun punches. Blow after blow, his features swelled, his defense shattered. Ryu had his eyes shut tight, whispering desperate prayers. When he finally cracked them open, he saw Ujiro already on his knees, broken in the dirt. Zed stood there, smirking, calm as ever. Ryu was in disbelief, but why? Had he forgotten Zed had already destroyed an entire prison block on his own? Poor Ujiro gasping, vision blurring, seeing only shadows. He couldn't accept it. Losing to a kid in front of everyone, it was the ultimate humiliation. Ujiro swung one last desperate punch, but Zed slipped past it like nothing and went full barrage again. A clean final strike cracked across the pit, dropping him flat on his back. Zed didn't waste time. He turned to the referee, demanding the match be called. He'd already won, but this was a betting house. The ref knew if he announced Zed the winner, the crowd would riot. Still, he had no choice. Ujiro wasn't moving. The call was made. Zed, the victor. Zed brushed it off, saying the fight wasn't even a warm-up. Later, with a bag of coins in hand, he scowled. It was too light. He asked why there was so little when 60 people had bet against him, and only one had bet in his favor. The bookie swore the math was right. The payout followed the system exactly. Zed pressed harder. With that kind of betting pool, the prize should have been massive. He called Ryu over, and one look at his face told the truth. He hadn't bet everything. Before Zed could rip into him, someone new appeared. Tall, long blue hair flowing, draped in a red dress. She had presence, that much was clear. But her face, pure villain, trouble written all over it. She stepped closer, saying she wanted a chat. Zed brushed her off, asking who she even was. She smirked, claiming it was obvious this was his first time here if he didn't know her. She introduced herself as Herna, the owner of the arena. But Zed wasn't interested. He walked right past, saying it was good to know but he wasn't here for conversation. Ryu's gut twisted. This wasn't going to end well. Sure enough, two giants stepped forward, blocking Zed's path like a living wall, iron jaws, shoulders like boulders. Zed tilted his head up, unfazed, warning them flatly that if they didn't move, they'd all end up on the ground. The guards exchanged confused looks, thinking the kid had completely lost it. And from behind, Herna's voice cut in. The warrior Zed had just beaten. He wasn't some local brawler. He had been brought in straight from the big city. He needed to understand the weight of her words. She would let him walk away today, but the next time, it would be on her terms. somewhere far less forgiving, dangerous. That woman played with fire, and Zed knew it. She liked strong men, and that alone made her even more of a threat. But somehow, he slipped away untouched. The next day, the two sat inside a bar. Ryu looked drained, glaring at Zed, calling him insane for standing so boldly in front of that woman. Didn't he realize? She controlled everything in that arena. Zed brushed it off, calling her nothing more than an old fox obsessed with money. Ryu admitted he was right. She was known as the Fox, and getting close to Zed had probably been her attempt to squeeze some advantage out of him. It wasn't the first time Zed had been branded a genius. Back in his rise, once the wins started stacking and his name began spreading, he was bombarded with offers, contracts, promises, endless deals. Naive at the time, he'd been scammed more than once. But by luck, he'd found a manager who had made him a world champion. Those experiences carved the truth deep into him. At the top, the only ones who survived were those who knew when to bite back. He'd called her an old fox for her wisdom. Soon, they'd see which of them was truly wiser. The meal they ordered finally arrived. Expensive meat, finely served. Ryu was ready to devour it instantly, but Zed stopped him. Something was off. The quality was nowhere near what they had ordered. No way it was that ultra-rare birdie steak. If it was, it wouldn't be available to every drunk sitting in that bar. Ryu waved it off, claiming food was food. Once in the stomach, it didn't matter. Zed didn't budge. If they paid for a birdie steak, then they'd damn well get one. He waved down a waiter. The man snapped at him, saying if he wanted to complain, he should leave, because no one wanted him around. Zed ignored him completely, stating flatly the steak was fake and they'd better bring the real one before talking back to him. The waiter scoffed, calling him crazy. Zed demanded to see the boss. That sealed it. The waiter thought the street rat had lost his mind, but he smirked anyway, saying fine, if he really wanted to meet the boss, then follow. The path, of course, led nowhere good. Inside the office sat a fat man surrounded by thugs, knives already raised and aimed at the door. The boss asked if Zed was the customer causing all the trouble. Zed answered that the real troublemakers were the ones selling fake goods in this dump. The fat man waved a hand, sending his first thug forward, saying the kid didn't understand the mess he'd walked into. But Zed was already smiling. Another fight. Another bit of fun. The bar's thugs rushed him, poor fools. Every one of them ended up the same. Faces smashed, bones snapped. One had his arm twisted and broken. Another dropped from a strike to the neck. Another flipped flat on his back after a clean counter. The fat boss, who had been laughing at first, quickly realized the tide had shifted. His men were scattered across the floor, broken and groaning, while Zed stood alone in the center, untouched. Ryu shouted a warning. This was the same kid who had dropped Walmart Ujiro. The boss froze. He'd heard whispers about that fight, but thought it was nothing more than rumor. Navi asked what Zed wanted. Zed laid it out clear. First, they'd return the money he had paid. Second, they'd cover the cost of the steak at the proper price of a real birdie steak. The fat man roared, calling them nothing but crooks. But the deal was made. Later, Ryu collapsed onto a soft bed, grinning like a fool, saying he'd never slept anywhere this comfortable. He rolled over, praising Zed as expected of someone from a powerful, noble family. Zed answered simply, negotiation was easy when you had power. Another night passed. As usual, Ryu had that strange look on his face in the dark. Out of nowhere, he sat up and called for Zed, asking if he was ready. Zed didn't answer, so Ryu left. But Zed was wide awake, watching him go, having seen everything. Days later, Ryu barged into the room, complaining he was starving, asking when they were heading out to eat. Zed, as always, had been training non-stop. Ryu asked how he never took a single break. Zed stood, pulling up his stats. Unfortunately, they weren't moving anymore. No matter how much he trained, mana remained locked at 0. He figured maybe it was because he was pushing from nothing to 1. The hardest part was dragging on. It was taking longer than expected. Zed turned to Ryu, announcing training was done. Time to get a steak for breakfast. 3 days had passed since their last visit, enough time for the staff to recover. Last time, they had devoured 10 portions, leaving the place in such a mess the workers ended up paying them instead. Zed asked how many coins were left. Ryu admitted they were almost broke, claiming the cost of living in the city was insane. Zed nodded, but inside he knew better. This was a game he had played for 10 years. He understood the economy here. 50 gold coins. That was their earnings. Not the kind of fortune that should vanish in just a few days. Maybe Ryu thought he was stupid, just some naive noble with no clue how the world worked. But Zed wasn't blind. Was it greed? Was he hiding something? Or maybe some addiction eating away at their stash? For now, he decided to play along, acting like he hadn't noticed. Ryu hadn't shown any signs of betrayal yet, but sooner or later he'd figure it out. At the bar, one of the men cracked the door open, reporting to the boss that the two had arrived. This time, they had a plan. Orders were given, get everyone ready. The moment Zed stepped inside, he was welcomed with a candlelit banquet. The waiter greeted him warmly, urging him to feel at home. Too warm, too fake. Zed's instincts screamed, why the sudden hospitality? His eyes scanned the room. No assassins hidden in the shadows. The restaurant looked normal, just like always. Then Ryu broke his focus, wrapping meat and lettuce together and offering it to him. Zed grabbed his hand, agreeing to eat, but keeping his guard up, eyes sweeping the room. The instant he bit down, he felt it. Something was off. He barked for Ryu to spit it out. Ryu spat immediately, panicked, demanding to know what poison trick this was. Zed analyzed calmly. The dose was small, not lethal, but no question about it. Something was happening behind the scenes. Zed pulled up his status screen and instantly understood why the staff had been so friendly. Absolute poison resistance. The trick had no effect on him. Still, he knew the truth. If he kept eating endlessly, eventually even that wouldn't save him. Ryu pressed him, asking if he was really sure it was poison. He hadn't smelled anything, hadn't noticed a thing. So why couldn't they eat? Zed brushed it off, saying it was because he was an Arohan, a deflection. Ryu snapped, angry at the arrogance. So that was it. His noble blood made him untouchable. The smile that crept across Zed's face was sharp. Time to make these bastards pay for trying something like that. Not long after, the boss arrived, furious, demanding to know what they wanted with him. Zed sat calmly at the back of the table, saying he was only curious and had questions. The boss's eyes darted to the empty plates. They'd eaten everything. The poison should be tearing them apart by now. The boss cut him off, saying he wasn't here to answer anything. He wouldn't waste words on brats trying to shake him down. Zed leaned forward, telling him he was the one misunderstanding the situation. He told Ryu to pass over some food so they could talk properly. Ryu, reluctant, handed over a meat roll he'd been holding for nearly an hour. The fat man just stood there, confused, demanding to know why they'd offer something like that. Zed told him it was a peace offering. If he ate, then he'd accept whatever terms came after. The boss snarled that he had no interest in peace. He wouldn't bow to a kid. Zed pressed harder. Maybe the man just enjoyed giving away his money, or maybe there was another reason he wouldn't touch the food, like the fact that it was poisoned. The fat man stammered, unable to answer. Zed slammed his foot into the table, flipping it. Meat scattered across the floor. His voice cut through the room. He'd been merciful up until now. But if this trash wanted to suffer, he'd give him plenty. The boss, sweating, smacked the wall, insisting there was no poison. He demanded proof. If they could show it, he'd admit it. Zed reached to his face, peeled out the contact lens, and revealed the truth. The red glow of an Arohan. The fat man's eyes went wide. Terror gripped him. He stumbled back, dropped hard to the floor, and collapsed onto his knees, begging, crying, apologizing. He swore he hadn't known. He hadn't realized he was dealing with a noble. The desperation bled from his voice as he pleaded, asking why someone from a house like that was out here, pretending to be a beggar. In that instant, Zed understood something crucial. The Arohan name carried far more weight than he had ever imagined. He asked the fat man if he would obey anything he commanded. The man, trembling, said yes. Zed laid out his first condition. His identity must remain a secret. The man agreed instantly. Then came the second condition. Half of all the boss's wealth would be handed over, and in exchange, Zed would act like none of this had ever happened. The Arohan reputation was so terrifying, Zed almost expected resistance, but the man didn't argue. No hesitation. He rushed out, vowing to bring the money quickly before the boy could change his mind. Zed slid the lenses back over his eyes. Ryu smirked, praising him, saying the Arohan name alone had crushed the man into submission. But Zed warned this would be their last night in the city. Before the thought could settle, someone else walked in. Arms crossed, eyes sharp, Herna. She claimed it was good to finally meet again. She praised him, saying he was even more impressive than she had expected. Zed froze. Did she know? Had she discovered his Arohan bloodline? For a second, it made sense, until he noticed the fat man shaking his head in denial, clearly terrified of revealing it, which meant Herna's information had probably come from the prison. If the boss realized Zed was just an abandoned Arohan, their deal would collapse. He had to end this quickly. He agreed to a private talk with her. Sitting across the table, he asked why she was here, why she was after him. Herna tilted her head and told him he was mistaken again. She hadn't come for him. She was there for a client. That was when Zed realized. The client was Ryu. Ryu apologized, admitting what he had done. Herna said she was sorry as well, but her side of the deal hadn't been completed yet. Ryu exploded, furious, saying that wasn't what they had agreed on, that he had already paid a fortune. But Herna shut him down, saying it was impossible. The person he wanted had been gone for too long. Alive or dead, nobody knew. Zed finally pieced it together. The real situation was clear now. He told her things would be handled differently. If she wanted to negotiate, then she would be negotiating with both of them. In short, Zed agreed to help Herna, but only if she solved Ryu's problem first. Herna thanked him, saying her request was simple. All she wanted was for him to fight Walmart Ujiro again. Ryu immediately called it a trap, but Zed didn't hesitate. He accepted on the spot. Herna, with that lip-filler smile, promised she'd keep her word. Later, the two walked through the streets. Ryu carried a small pouch of coins, his face dark. Zed asked why he looked like that. They'd made plenty of money. Ryu admitted he was sorry. He hadn't wanted to keep things hidden. Since Herna knew the city and everyone passing through, he thought she could be a good lead, but he should have told Zed before making the deal. Zed told him it was fine. He'd known from the start Ryu was stealing money. That stunned Ryu, but Zed added that he'd only just figured out the money was going straight to Herna. Ryu demanded to know why he hadn't said anything. Zed shrugged, because he didn't care. The help Ryu had given him was worth more than those coins. But he warned him. He wasn't the type to let things slide forever. From now on, there would be no more secrets. No matter where he came from, Ryu couldn't act like trash. He apologized, swearing he'd never do it again. Even so, he begged Zed not to take the fight. They could just grab the money and disappear. Zed asked how he expected to find his brother if they ran. Ryu's voice broke. He already knew. Herna was going to scam them again. Zed thought about it. Ryu wasn't an idiot. His choice to go to Herna meant he was desperate. He knew it was a bad deal. He knew the odds were low, but he had no other way. And Herna? She was the kind of predator who thrived on desperate kids like him, bleeding them dry, then tossing them aside.